Hello, Fox Vandy here. Welcome. Today I'm gonna be putting out a little longer video than I usually do. You may hear Maxie yapping in the background every now and then. You may hear the sound from my air conditioner. You get to see this mess behind me, as usual. You may even hear somebody knocking at the door every now and then. That happens, and I'll have to take a break, or if the phone rings, I'll have to take a break. So today is going to be sort of a confession of things I have never really shared in detail on my channel. So you're going to be the first to hear some of these things. I share a lot of personal stuff, but this is probably the deepest personal video I've ever done, as far as things I've done and what I was like before you met me on YouTube. I'm going to go back to doing a video like I did right from the beginning, where I just talked to you casually with all the flaws, all the bloopers, all the mess ups, and I hope you'll like it. Today I would like to talk about my habit with cigarette smoking. I usually prefer not to talk about it, but today I thought I would share a little backstory of my smoking. I was the third child of 5 kids, born to Mary and Larry. I was born in Washington, D.C. We lived back east, for the most part, for the first few years of my life. My parents were not totally uneducated. My mother worked for IBM for many years. My dad told the story of how he was a chiropractor. How much of that story is true, who knows? But later on, in Chicago, he worked in the bakeries and as a chef. Whether he was a good chef, I don't know. What I do know is that when we were in Chicago, I do have memories from there. My dad always said that we were being chased by the Chicago Mafia. That's why we moved all the time, and why we did it so secretly in the middle of the night, because he's trying to hide from the Mafia. That's the story of why we started traveling and moving all the time. So after I was about five 5 years old, maybe a little older, I know over the period of the first 5 years, we did spend some time in California. So my oldest sister was born in California. Then my brother and I were born in DC. The sister under me was born in Long Beach, and my baby sister was born in Los Angeles. So we did spend some time in California over the years. We also lived in Michigan, all over Illinois, I believe West Virginia or Maryland. We lived all over the country, really, even before we started working in the crops. So we were always transient, nomadic. My parents usually had a station wagon, and 5 kids were piled into the car on top of all our belongings. Sometimes we had boxes tied to the top of the car. Both of my parents were heavy smokers, and they both smoked in the car with us 5 kids. All their friends were smokers. Everybody we knew were smokers. I don't think my parents had any very long-term friends, because they never stayed in one place long enough to really establish close friendships. We didn't have the technology that we have today to keep in touch. So heavy smokers in a car with 5 kids, 4 in the back stretched out laying down on top of all our belongings, and the one in the front. Usually the baby or the oldest one would take turns in the front seat with mom and dad. I breathed smoke from the day I was born. It is funny with 5 kids that none of us really had that many colds or asthma or bronchial problems. A little bit like normal, but nothing severe. My parents were pretty healthy when they were young. My dad did have some heart issues, but my mother was very healthy. She was a very hard worker, raising 5 kids. And to tell you the truth, that would drive me to smoking with 5 rough and tumble kids, always bickering and arguing, fighting to get the best of everything. There was the normal, that kind of lifestyle. There was also a lot of bad things going on in my life, and I'm not going to share those stories with you today, but I will tell you that it was not that great. So by the time I was 5 or 6, we were traveling all around the country, starting to work in the crops. And we followed the crops from state to state or town to town. We usually either stayed in our car camping along the side of the road, and back then, in those days, you could do that, or we'd find a state or national park to camp. We moved into very low income trailer parks. We lived in public housing. So all that I remember is we were very poor, and we lived in the areas that poor people lived. So I'm sure there were drugs going on in those days, but it wasn't that well known. It wasn't publicized. Again, we didn't have the technology that we do have today. So uh, my parents would smoke, sometimes even before buying food. They always had the money for the cigarettes. Sometimes they didn't have the money for food. So I remember eating a lot of peanut butter crackers on the road. We would have sometimes Velveeta cheese sandwiches. Um, Rarely, when we were traveling, did we ever have lunch meat. There was no room for an ice chest in a family of 7 in a car with everything you owned. So I remember them both smoking and blowing smoke in the back of the car. And I remember growing up and always saying, I'm never going to smoke. I hate cigarettes. They stink. I'm never going to smoke. And I really meant it, and I really believed it. I'll share a story. My mother, one time, my dad was already in California, and so my mother piled us 5 kids in the car, and we had to come over the Grapevine. Grapevine is a very steep hill or mountain in California, and we had to come through there in the winter time with the ice and snow. And back then, the road was pretty treacherous, and they didn't maintain the highways back then like they do today. So I remember up in the car we were in, the brakes were going out. They would barely work, and Mom was slipping and sliding around the highway. Us kids are panicking and scared. My mother had really only recently learned to drive. And I remember she was smoking a cigarette. And she said, she put that cigarette out. She said, Lord, if you get me down off this mountain, I'll quit smoking. We got to the bottom of the grapevine. And the first thing she did is pull out a cigarette, lit up. That's a very vivid memory for me. So cigarettes were always in my life. I never knew what it was like to be in a smoke-free environment. Back in those days, people could smoke everywhere. Even when Mom took us kids to church, we would stand right outside the front doors at the church with 90% of the people that went there were smokers. So we stood all outside and smoked cigarettes. I shouldn't say we, I was still a kid. But they all stood around outside and smoked. Even as I got older, they still did that till at least probably 15 or 20 years ago. You could smoke there around the church. You could smoke in restaurants and grocery stores. Anywhere you went, smoking was allowed and actually encouraged. Half of the commercials you would see on TV when they finally came out with TV, when we got one, were about cigarettes. Even when I gave birth to my first child in Palm Springs, we were allowed to smoke around the hospital. I never quit smoking when I was pregnant. So I was basically taught that smoking is good. Back then, more people smoked than not, really. And that was the environment and the culture I was raised in. We worked in the fields, and I always Felt like there's got to be a better life, but my life got steadily worse as a child. I've shared a lot of stories about my childhood on my channel, and if you want to know more about it, you need to go back and watch some of my earlier videos. I was terrible, but anyhow, I do share a lot of stories back then. Working in the fields one day, my mom had to go into town to pick up surplus commodities. That was food, government food for people of very low income. She left my sister that's younger than me with me in the fields, picking the green beans off the vines. She took my baby sister with her. My brother, I think he was working on a different row in the fields. My older sister had already left home. I can't remember how old I was when this happened, but I was around 15 years old. When she got back, the field boss told her that us two girls were too busy flirting with the boys on the rows next to us, and that we didn't do a good job our cleaning all the beans off the vines. And we had moved to new rows, and so my mother came and found us, and she took us back to the cabin. We were staying in a one-room cabin with public toilets in another building. And she got out my dad's razor strap, and she proceeded to beat me and my sister based on what the field boss told her. I ran away from home that day. I've shared that story on one of my videos, but I ended up in a foster home. So in the foster home, they had 5 foster children and their daughter. So there was 6 kids in this home. I shared this story about that too, how that was the first time in my life I could have milk anytime I wanted, all the ice cream I ever wanted. We would, actually was having a real life, a real childhood for a few months there. And I had 2 foster sisters, and they would take me along with them. We skipped school, and we went to this man's house. They were doing drugs, smoking cigarettes, drinking, doing everything immoral. We did that pretty regularly. I probably stayed out of school more than in, unbeknownst to my foster parents. We would forge our family signatures saying why we were missing from school when we went back. That's when I first tried cigarettes. The girls convinced me I needed to try. So I did smoke a few cigarettes, but um, I really didn't enjoy it. But I did it because I wanted to fit in and be part of the crowd. Later, when my sister and her husband brought me out of the foster home to California, I had a real family, my own family. I lived with them and my 2 nieces, which were the littlest one was barely walking. And I started going to school and I surrounded myself with a young Christian youth group, and everything was great. I had an involvement with a boy named Skip when I was in the 3rd grade in a town called Desert Hot Springs outside of Palm Springs. That's where I met him, and I fell in love with him at right then and there. He was always in trouble, but I really liked him. Actually, he was the first boy that ever kissed me. He asked me to kiss me. So over the years, even though we moved all the time, we all would always seem to end up back in that area during the winters for several months, and we would hook up again. So when I went to live with my sister and her husband, I was at school one day. I went to school with Skip's brother, and he told Skip I was there. I was dating a guy at the time, and Skip walked up to me in the high school, and when I saw him, we like merged together, almost running. We were so happy to see each other. I immediately dropped my boyfriend to be with Skip. Skip was in and out of California Youth Authority for one reason or another throughout his young life. He did have an alcoholic father, apparently abusive, and a very dysfunctional family like ours. And so he did spend a lot of time under house rule, whatever. So when he came to the school and I hooked up with him, one day he came to the school and brought a gun. And he talked me into put it in my locker. In high school, everybody was smoking on the grounds, constantly. Going to the bathrooms, I remember I kind of rejected it all. I didn't really fit into it with anybody except the church group. But the more time I've spent with Skip, he was into drugs, he was a heavy smoker, he was a good looking guy, and he attracted people like a magnet. So my sister wasn't very happy with me dating Skip. She knew he was trouble. But I didn't care. I finally had a boy that really, really cared about me. And he loved me. He treated me good, really good. We dated, we went places together. But as time progressed, he got worse with the drugs. And so at one point, my brother in law got transferred from the gas company to work in Blythe, California, just very close to the Arizona border. So we moved there. And that was when my whole life turned upside down. For the first time in my life, I had stability with my sister and her husband. And now we had to move and leave all my friends behind. The first time in my life I was ever accepted. Had fun, did things that kids do. I even went to the junior senior prom. I had never had any excitement like I had when I was with them. So we moved to Blythe, and Skip followed us. He found a little room, kind of an old, messed up motel for really cheap. I guess he got a job, but he was on heavy drugs at the time. So I don't think he kept the job very long. And he was starting to behave from the drugs. So one day I went to see him. My sister took me over, and he was laid out on the ground. He was physically and verbally abusive towards me in front of my sister, and she was mad. She was so mad. So we left, and but I didn't leave him. So I kept up the relationship. That's the area when I really started smoking. The first time I lit a cigarette, it didn't faze me. I lit another one. It still didn't faze me. I smoked 3 or 4 cigarettes the very first time, and I never got a headache. I never got dizzy or lightheaded or nothing. So from that day on, I kept smoking, and I was addicted right then and there. The minute I thought I didn't have a cigarette, I was going mentally crazy. I had to have a cigarette. So I did what I could to get cigarettes. And during that time, Skip was sniffing gas, sniffing glue, taking uppers and downers, drinking heavily, hanging out with all the wrong people, and I followed suit. I did almost all those things except taking the uppers and downers at that time. I didn't, but I did try. I sniffed glue. I smoked heavily. I drank a few times, but I never could handle alcohol. My body rejected it. The minute I took a drink, I got sick, nauseous. I would pass out easily. I was so tipsy topsy. I couldn't function, and it really apparently I had almost an allergic reaction to alcohol. So growing up, my parents were never, during the time they were raising us kids, they were never heavy drinkers. They really were just social drinkers when they got together with other adults. So I really was not too much subjected to alcoholism as a kid. Although before us kids were born, my parents have the only pictures they had is in a bar drinking together, things like that. So pretty much, so I know they were heavy drinkers before they had the kids. Anyhow, that's my induction to cigarette smoking. Over the years, I just smoked more and more, and I would do pretty much whatever I had to be able to afford to buy cigarettes. I was still poor, but I worked sometimes 2 and 3 jobs just to support myself. I got married, not to Skip at first, another man, but I was pregnant with Skip's child. So that's part one of my confession. If I have piqued your interest, I will do a several part series going from here. I will probably put out 2 videos a week till this series is over on this subject, um, and some other kinds of videos in between. I do videos or premieres on Sundays, usually around 1 o'clock Mountain Standard Time. Right now, Mountain Standard Time is the same as Pacific Time, but our time zone doesn't change. So that would be 3 o'clock Central Time, I believe, and 4 o'clock Eastern Time. I also do a live stream on the first and third Saturday evening at 8 p.m. Mountain Standard Time each month. I put out periodic videos throughout the week, sometimes a little shorter or sometimes a little shout out video. I have memberships on my channel starting at $2. So if you're interested in that, supporting me on a monthly basis, check out the link in the description below this video. I will try to link some of my videos of talking about these things in the past into the description, but I don't know if I can figure out which ones are which. So you may have to go back and watch my playlist, which would help me a great deal. Okay, so next time I come on here talking about my confession, this will lead up to where I am today over time and why I'm still smoking. So hope you enjoyed this. If you did, if you're not already subscribed, hit the subscribe button and hit the bell and click on all so you'll be notified when I put out a new video. Hit the thumbs up, it helps my channel, so YouTube will push out my videos. I share my life story, people, in the hopes that it will help somebody else that has gone through or going through a lot of the same kinds of things. I hope to inspire people to have faith in God, love your neighbor, and love yourself. Thank you for coming.